Association of Foreign Affairs lecture tonight, as we did yesterday. We're in a cooperation actually. Sasnet, Swedish studies.
South Asian Studies Network. I will say a couple of words about that.
So take it away.
Thank you, Oscar. Yes, my name is Lina Hiltman and I come from Sasnet, the South Asian Studies Network here in Lund. And we're very happy to have this joint cooperation with the UPF and to invite Asha Mukherjee, professor from India here. And you will talk about human rights, if they're inclusive or exclusive in India. We're very happy to listen to you and to see what you have to say about this. I would just say a couple of short words about Sasnet. We're a network here at Lund University, so we are here to support and encourage research and education about South Asia. So if you're interested in that region, do not hesitate to contact us, and we will help you by any means. I mean, to start up projects, if you're going abroad to study, if you know someone in South Asia that would like to come here. We have a wide network internationally. Yes. So now I leave the floor here to Professor Mukherjee. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I want to thank Sasnet and also UPF seminar, UPF for giving me this opportunity to speak and also to sort of share some of my ideas with you people. And I'm really delighted that I have all this young generation in front of me, and I'm sure that we will have some discussion over on the issues we should be discussing today here. So, is it my part? Yeah. Okay. So today's topic, as you all know, is human rights in India, exclusive or inclusive. You can see that there is a kind of brief abstract, which is basically kind of give you an idea what I'm going to talk about. It is often suggested that human rights and duties are two sides of the same coin, and yet in Indian context, traditionally we have dharma discourse, which is based on obligation, and the issue of human rights have never been the center of discussion, nor it has been a problem for Indian masses. I will talk about this in detail when I will be going further. But I suppose I should say a word about dharma discourse, because basically Indian tradition, I'm talking about the Asian tradition, we have the concept of dharma, which is very prevalent in most of the religious traditions of India, for example, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. And this whole concept of dharma is basically a kind of coordination principle where everybody coordinates for the sake of the society and everyone has to fulfill the obligation. I will go into detail when I will talk about the caste system, etc. So this has never been taken, with your permission maybe I can sit here. So this has never been a kind of problem for Indian masses. In modern India, human rights have been reconciled or discovered within Hinduism and its caste system, which necessarily generates tension and conflict due to the complexity and multi-layered structure, and also since opportunities are not in abundance. Now the whole issue of human rights becomes more important because India is a poor country still, and it's still a developing country. It's not developed as yet. And of course, earlier it was underdeveloped. So within that kind of situation, because we don't really have the resources which are in abundance, rather we have scarcity, and scarcity of resources it's more important to talk about human rights, and that actually becomes rather a very, very complex situation. Who deserves what and who decides are extremely important questions. It is argued that in India, today we face the most difficult questions: how to include the excluded and how to exclude the included, which means that in India we have this caste system, and I'm quite sure that some of you at least are familiar with the caste system which we have, and even today it's extremely prevalent within the society. And this caste system is a kind of multi-layered extremely complex system. And because of this, within the structure, the social structure, people who come into power, whatever power it is, whether economic power or political power or social power, they decide who deserves what. And therefore, this whole question that how to include the excluded, those who have been excluded since ancient times, we need to include them. And how to exclude the included, and those who have been in power during the ancient times and even today, and who are sort of enjoying that ancient tradition, how to exclude them. Exclude means, they should not be powerful in that sense, and therefore I'm using perhaps a stronger word to exclude them. But the intention is not really to exclude, but to sort of make them less powerful. That's the idea. So at the core of human rights debates, there lies a need to interrogate the very being of individual, person, self and other, for accommodating the claims and the counterclaims of rights to be creatively human, the promise of mankind which gets threatened by any destructive self of the few in power. And even today we find that those who are powerful, they are really a few, and they, with their destructive intentions, sort of dominate the whole society. And therefore, we need to sort of look into that complexity and find out ways that how to exclude the destructive kind of nature and destructive self of the few who are in power, either political or social or economic or religious. What we find in India today is more and more divide between the self and the other. So, on the name of rights, on the one hand, we find a kind of divide between the self and the other. Self could be of any kind, of any individual in that sense, and the other, on the name of democracy. There is no automatic guarantee of success by the mere existence of democratic institutions. Democratic institutions like that of all other institutions depend on the activities of human agents in utilizing their opportunities for reasonable realization. Now, with this brief kind of abstract, I'm going to go to the real sort of issues which I'm going to talk about. What are human rights and what is their concern? Modern thinkers seem to be concerned with namely four ways of looking at rights. Rights as liberties, rights as claims, rights as entitlement, and rights as trumps. I wouldn't really have time to go deep into it, but I'm sure some of you must be familiar with this. Rights as entitlement has been talked about much more by in a book called Anarchist State and Utopia by Robert Nozick, and rights as claims and liberties is talked about by John Rawls. When in conflict, negotiate to reduce the tension, but not absolute. Some of them are saying that rights are absolute, which are never fulfilled and never finished. I mean, you can never achieve this ideal. It's like an ideal. On the other hand, there are some thinkers who are talking about rights which are just, they are not absolute, but you can negotiate them, and they are a kind of, when they create some kind of tension, then perhaps one can reduce the tension by negotiating. And they have been integrally related with discourse on duties and discourse on rights. Now, I'm saying this because the discourse of duties and discourse of rights are two sides of the same coin. When we are saying that someone has a duty, means that the other one has the right. In the sense that suppose I sort of work for a company, and a company is supposed to pay me, say, I don't know, maybe 10,000 crown for a month, and if they don't, if the company doesn't give me, then it is my right to claim that the company must pay me. And on the other hand, the company has a duty to pay me, and therefore the rights and duties, these are two sides of the same coin. Now, these two discourses are not only, but still, the kind of issue which I'm sort of focusing on is that in Indian tradition, the duty-put discourse have been extremely important, whereas the right discourse has not been really looked into at all in the ancient times. Whereas situation changed after independence. And after independence, the whole constitution was based on the human rights, and therefore the whole discourse after the human rights is sort of creating some kind of tension between the people and the society. So these two discourses are not only comparable but also to a certain extent convertible. This does not mean that both have the same extension. For Kant, Immanuel Kant, for example, a rationally based concept of self-respect breaks free of a notion of rights. Rights are claims against others, whereas the obligation of human being pertains both to mass as such towards himself and others. Thus, duties discourse provide a broader base and goal for human development. Dharma talk corresponds. There have been some kind of Indian scholars who have been arguing that the dharma discourse which we find in India is a kind of discourse that corresponds to duty discourse in Indian context as the Raj Dharma, the duty of a king, represents the duty of the king as a ruler, and the duty of the layman, which is called Praja Dharma, to be loyal to the king. The king has to look after the interest of the individuals, of the people who are in his kingdom, and the people who are living in that kingdom, they have a kind of duty to be loyal to the king. And there was no scope for the individual to revolt as a matter of right or as a claim. And this is a kind of a duty, and a duty for both on the people who are living in that kingdom and the king who is ruling their kingdom. So therefore it's a duty. The emphasis is on the duty and not on the rights. Is this creating something?
Oscar?
I think we can turn it off.
Okay.
So it is often claimed that the ego or the self of an average Indian was so submerged and absorbed into universal harmony based on the doctrine of dharma that the issue of human rights has never been a problem for Indian masses. Individuals always with the support and care of their social existence. The unity is achieved on the basis of cooperation. So as you can see that king and the masses, unless they cooperate, the society wouldn't be able to live with, to develop it. And therefore, the individual is always with the support and care of their social existence. The unity is achieved on the basis of cooperation rather than the spirit of rebellion. The society in its political tradition was a society of internalized discipline of each and every individual. As a result of performing his function and duties and the sum total of performances by all members of the society, the orderly community's existence was achieved. Thus, the classical Indian political system was society-centered as it subordinated state and government to the society's mandates. The society was not based on self-interest, but was like an integral unit. If Shudras, now I'm sort of going into details of the social structure of Indian society. I'm sure that you are familiar with this class structure we have. We have 4 classes. The uppermost class is Brahmin class, then you have Vaishyas and Kshatriyas, and then you have Shudras. Vaishyas are the merchant class, and the Kshatriyas are the warrior class, and the Shudras are the lowest class which is supposed to serve the whole society, like cobbler and fisherman, anybody who cleans the house and all that. So the whole society has been basically divided into 4 classes: Brahmin, Vaishya, and Kshatriya, and Shudras. Now within this, Brahmins were the highest class, and even they are enjoying this highest status, and then you have the other classes, and Shudras is the lowest class, and being the lowest class, I'm sure you have heard Gandhi, and you have known about Gandhi, and then he talked about untouchables. There should be no untouchables. There have been movements against, which Gandhi actually started, that and many other people have started in the modern times. And all these were kind of uplifting the Shudras, the lowest class. Now, all these attempts have been sort of revolutionary in some sense, in the sense that they all came with the Western education within Indian context. So society was not based on, now earlier, I'm talking about ancient times, this society was not based on self-interest, but was like an integral unit. If Shudras were required by sacred law to be servants of higher caste, the higher caste were ordained by the same law to look after Shudras and their families as a matter of duty. So all these upper class people, they were they were bound by their duty to look after the lower class without any exception. Each part or group contributed to receive from the whole. The good of an individual was tied with the good of all. The problem started in 1857 with the British Raj, British rule, and the struggle for the independence and the gradual exposure with the Western knowledge. It was this new consciousness. So you can see that this whole colonial rule brought this educational reformation, this exposure to the education system and the democratic value. And from there, the whole change started. It was in this new consciousness with the new leaders like Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Keshav Chandra Sen, Dayanand Saraswati, Vivekananda, Gandhi and Tagore, though Tagore not so much, who started Swadeshi, kind of nationalist movement, trend along with the many others, the considerations of human rights in India. So actually the whole discourse of human rights starts from this time, which is around say 1857 and onwards. The discussion of human rights in relation to the caste system is crucially important as well as complicated, but we would briefly discuss here to have some idea of how it plays an important role. How it plays an important role in politics of human rights in India. A long debate between the scholars have been and still continuing in whether the concept of human rights can be consistently developed within the caste system. Indian civilization based on dharma often been claimed by scholars as creative and communicative, and claimed to be understood as human dignity and worth in terms of justice, unity and benevolence, as virtue for human fulfillment, along with theological insights and metaphysical doctrines. Dharma has both descriptive and prescriptive contents, the way things are and the way things ought to be. So dharma actually means that, for example, it also means the nature of the things. It has a different, dharma comes from the Sanskrit word dhri. The word starts dhri dhatu. So the one which holds together. And in that sense, it's a description, that which holds together. And in that sense, it's a description, which is nature of the things. But on the other hand, it is also as the things ought to be, in the sense that how one ought to behave, like as being a Brahmin, what duties you are supposed to perform towards others, towards the society, towards the whole system. As a Kshatriya, means warrior, what duties you have to perform as a warrior, to protect the country, to protect the area. Exactly in the same, being a merchant, the economic power, economic responsibility was on the merchants. And therefore, dharma has a very important and very complicated meaning, which is extremely complicated. On the one hand, it is how the things are, on the other hand, how the things ought to be. So it has descriptive and prescriptive contents, the way things are and the way things ought to be. The nature of man and the obligations or duties. Dharma also transcends man and accompanies him in the world thereafter. Now, dharma is also a law, a kind of principle on the basis of which, depending on what actions you are doing today in your life, this will determine how your life will be thereafter. So your actions will determine. If you are doing good actions, then you will have good effects. If you are doing bad actions, then you will have bad effects. So if you really have some bad thing happening in this life, means that you must have done something bad in your previous life. So it is a principle of rebirth, and also it's a kind of also transcends man and accompanies him in the world thereafter, even after rebirth. So it is said to be accumulated through the process of rebirth. Dharma can be understood in its various connotations, such as dharma is religion. Dharma is also, for example, if someone is asking, often for applying for the visa or passport, what has to, it is asked, what is your dharma? Means that what is your religion? So dharma is also taken as a religion, as human dignity, as metaphysical foundation of human rights, as customary morality, as reflective morality, as justice, as law, as consideration for the other, etc., which may not be different from each other. So they are all related with each other, in fact. I would say that they are all related with each other. B.R. Ambedkar, the person who wrote India's constitution, I suppose if you are familiar with, he just got, at least those who are keeping some information from India, they would know he got the Best Indian Award just last week. So B.R. Ambedkar, who himself was born as untouchable, he actually was born as an untouchable in the lowest caste as a Shudra, played the vital role, and he became, after getting education and everything, he became the barrister and the lawyer, and then he actually wrote the Constitution of India before independence. So he was born as untouchable, played the vital role in drafting the Indian Constitution, which included the right of equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, right to freedom of religion, right to property, right to constitutional remedies, challenging all forms of inequalities prominent in India, making it much wider than fundamental rights. So just as you have in the United Nations, you have these fundamental rights. So actually, he applies this notion of human rights into Indian context, and he makes it extremely wide, which actually includes all the complexities of Indian society. He was of the opinion that human rights cannot be reconciled within Hinduism. So there has been a debate. Some Indians have been trying to say that human rights can be accommodated and also reconciled within the Indian, ancient system, whatever we have. But he was of the view that human rights cannot be reconciled within the Hinduism and its caste system, and he converted himself to Buddhism. He didn't want to remain as Hindu, and he converted himself to Buddhism. Other scholars like Radhakrishnan thought that if democracy is to be seriously implemented, then caste and untouchability should go. So people were really of the opinion that human rights discourse actually needs to be accommodated within the Indian system, and for that, if necessary, we will have to change the kind of parameters and we have to reinterpret Hinduism and the religions which we are living with. Now, contrary to the view of the unity in diversity, and I'm sure you are all familiar, that India has always been claimed as the land of unity in diversity, one may argue that the dual system authority necessarily generates tension and conflict. My teacher, Dayakrishna, says that Indian history and mythology are full of instances of this tension and conflict. So, often it is claimed that Indian history has been a history of peaceful coexistence. But we also have a picture, and we also have scholars saying that in India history has never been peaceful. We always had conflict. On the face of it, you might have some kind of peaceful picture, but actually it has never been peaceful. So Indian history and mythology are full of instances of this tension and conflict. Even the standard texts on society and polity are replete with evidences of this, and try to seek reconciliation between them in some way or the other. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that tradition could never decide as to who is really superior in status and authority. We always had conflict, and therefore I mean, we had all sorts of, like in ancient times, we had all this caste system. When we had the Muslim ruling sort of rulers, then of course the kings were there, Muslim kings were there, so they became powerful, and because of that, so we always had a problem of superiority and authority. The real power has always been with the king, but ideally it was the Brahmana, the highest class, who was regarded as superior, who would govern the king. So even in the Muslim ruling times, we always had a guru and it was called as Rajguru, who would decide, who would advise, how to rule the country. So therefore, the Brahmin, the highest class, was always superior, who would govern the king. The conflict between the ideal and actual is perhaps nowhere more clearly documented or evidenced than in the Smriti text devoted to the subject. Now, there is a good deal of discussion about who is entitled to be a king. Little about who can perform Brahmanical functions. So, who is entitled to be king, this has always been a kind of discussion, and through discussions and debates and through arguments we could decide, if there was a controversy, then there was a discussion. But if a Shudra or Vaishya, Vaishya means the merchant, can they perform the role of a Brahmin? Brahmins were supposed to be the teachers, who would perform the kind of duties in the temple, who would read the scripts and scriptures, who would interpret. So this was their task. All the education was only exposed to the Brahmins. And only Brahmins were actually entitled to interpret and read the text. But rest of the classes, they were not allowed unless there was some kind of crisis. So we find discussion on apad dharma, which is like when there's some kind of critical situation arises. So apad dharma is when you have some kind of crisis of a Brahmin. If Brahmin is, for example, he can even beg to, if he doesn't have the money or to get the food, then he can beg to have his food. So he could even beg, and because if he is in trouble and that kind of, so it's the crisis. But what happens to the other classes? There's no discussion. One presumes the same principle applies to all. But if there is some kind of crisis principle or crisis situation for a Brahmin, then there should be some kind of crisis situation for other classes also. But you find only for the Brahmins, but you don't find any discussion on the other classes. A Brahmin, for example, can perform the function of a Kshatriya if he's in crisis. If necessary, he can take he can defend the country, or he can defend his territory. Or a Vaishya is at times in distress, but can reverse also be allowed? There's no discussion on that. If a Brahmin, if a Vaishya and Kshatriya is in trouble, can he perform the duties of a Brahmin? There's no discussion, nowhere. Absolutely closed. Now this is kind of, you can see that this is kind of prejudice which was always there. So there's another approach which suggests, rather than doing away with the caste, the human rights can be derived from the caste system itself. There's another approach.
So back not until 60 years ago. It's quite famous at the moment, and they're having lots of chapters growing up everywhere. And your colleague, Sasnet, he was here last week. He was also doing research in Maharashtra on the Buddhist movement. So my question is, has there also been an assimilation of the caste system in the neo-Buddhist movement? Or because they argue, of course, also that they want to free the Shudras, the Dalits, from the suppression by converting to a new religious system and thereby escaping the depression in the Hindu system. So, do you see any signs that even in this Buddhist movement you have the same structures?
Do you want my honest opinion?
Always honest, yeah.
Because I have seen, as I said, I come from Santiniketan, and we do have, a lot of monasteries. Actually, 2 monasteries have come up recently within Santiniketan itself. And theoretically, no. I mean, the answer to your question theoretically is no.
But it's the same for the other religions. Theoretically, they claim that, of course, there's equality.
Exactly. So theoretically, it definitely is a better alternative for people, even with after conversion. But practically, again, yes. Unfortunately, even within New Buddhist monasteries, I've seen. If you go close and if you really look at the patterns of behavior minutely, you will find that even there, the caste system prevails. That's why I said, if you want my honest, I haven't really done research on that, but I guess one can do that and find it. There is some kind of, but yes, if you're talking about degrees, I would say much less. In degrees, if you're talking about, it's much less, because there is a kind of attitude that they should be at equal place.
It has been argued that it's much more dominated by class in a way that you have like a social class of Brahmin who are then leaders in the New Buddhist movement, but that it's not so much on caste. Would you go with that, or do you think it's still very much on?
No, it's not so much on caste. Yes, you're right. It's not so much on caste, but it could be class, or it could be some other factors. There could be many other factors. Because within their system also they have a hierarchy. Within the monastery system also they have a hierarchy. So equality is there also looked at. But theoretically, yes, it's much more liberating.
Thank you again, Asha.